So, as I said, this is a very accessory-rich project, and by that I mean I have lots of little miniature royal icing transfers, both on top of the grill. The grill itself is actually a delicate royal icing transfer that sits suspended in the inside of the grill. The grass, the flowers, all royal icing transfers. In addition, I have some fondant elements on the piece, the handles, little spatulas I don't have out, but you'll see them here on the tray. I am going to show you 5 of the elements in detail, the ones that are a little less intuitive and a little more complicated, starting first with these adorable little hamburgers. These are royal icing transfers, but done not by piping the transfer, by actually shaping the royal icing. That's why it's kind of unique. And to do that, I've got what I call royal icing putty. It's just super thick royal icing. So thick I can pick it up without it sticking to my hands. It's kind of Play-Doh consistency, and I like it that way because when I shape it into these little patties, it has some cracks and crevices to it that look kind of hamburger-like. So I'm just picking up a little bit. These are maybe a little less than a ½ inch in diameter, between 1/4 inch and a ½ inch, so they're pretty tiny. So just shaping them, not rounding them too much. I like to leave a few little cracks like so. And I would shape them on acetate because the royal icing is a little bit tacky and it will need some drying time before I can put it on the grills, and it'll just pop off this acetate lined cardboard that much more easily. But before they completely dry, that's the general process of shaping them, I do like to give them some grill marks, and to do that I'm taking my liquid gel food coloring. This is my black. This time it's actually non-diluted, it's just straight up, and I'm going to kind of draw it. I'm going to try drawing it across with my trussing needle, pressing in slightly, and you'll get some variations. Some of the grill marks will be thicker than others. In some areas it might be thinner. If you break the hamburger, you can smush it back together. That's okay too. Let's see if I can get a little more delicate tracing on this one. It just won't push as hard, and I have slightly less food coloring on here, I think. There we go. So that's the general process. Now, let me talk about some other elements that I've made that go along with the hamburgers. I've got little hot dog, or rather hamburger buns and hot dog buns. These are basic 2-dimensional royal icing transfers, a little ivory icing piped into rounds using a loose royal icing, and then I've painted them with a little brown food coloring to give them an effect of some browning on top of the bun. The cheese that will go on the cheeseburgers are little fondant squares. Just roll them through my pasta machine on the very finest setting, which is number 9, and cut them into tiny squares. The hot dogs, simple royal icing transfer, so I'm not going to do them again today using relatively thick icing, using a round pastry tip. I used a number 3 or number 4. I'll have the exact pastry tip in the video description to create a hot dog shape and similar hot dog buns to go with them. Moving on to things that will go underneath the grill, I've got grass, another basic 2-dimensional transfer. Whenever I'm doing a 2-dimensional transfer that I want to hold its shape, I use a relatively thick icing. So for the grass, I wanted these nice fine strands or blades of grass, so I used a relatively thick outlining consistency to pipe the grass onto acetate. They're still stuck on the acetate here. Whereas by contrast, to do the buns where I want them to be rounded and nicely domed on top, I'll use a loose royal icing. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to do the daisies for you. These daisies are a different type of 2-dimensional transfer that we haven't done before that involve the piping of 2 colors. But I'd like to pipe all the centers first and allow them to partially set before piping the leaves, or petals I should say, around them. Because if you pipe wet next to wet too quickly, the centers and the petals will all merge together into one big blob, and we don't want that. But a lot of setting time depends on your ambient conditions. If it's really dry out, they'll set more quickly, dry and hot. If it's cool and damp, it'll take longer to dry. So I've got a similar consistency white icing in here. It's forming a bead, but there's a teeny bit of a peak to it. It eventually settles out. This white icing is a little bit thicker than my yellow. I could thin it if I was being really fussy. So hopefully there's been enough setting time that I can pipe this next to the yellow without it completely merging into it. And it's merging a little bit. Ideally, I'd give this a little more drying time. But the next step is adding all the next set of petals. So again, you want to allow enough drying time to put the next petal near it. So go all the way down the row. You usually can fit about 5 petals around these. Fourth petal going down, and I'll usually rotate at this point so that I can make sure that as I'm piping it, it's making contact with the yellow center. If it doesn't make contact with the center, when you pop it off the acetate, some of the petals might fall off. Okay, so that's daisy transfers, a little variation on the 2-dimensional transfers that I cover in great detail in another video. Let me move on to talk about some of the other accessories and to show you a couple more. Moving on to some fondant appliques, fondant pieces that are going on the grill. I'm not going to make these, but these were shaped with a gray fondant using the back end of a pastry tip to cut them, and then a smaller number 1 or number 2 tip to cut the holes in the top. These are going to be little vents. These were shaped over my silicone molds and then sprayed with a silver spray. Similarly, the little handles, I created a cord of fondant and then just capped them off with a darker gray fondant. For the wheels, recall we sponged the wheels. I've also applied some black fondant and white fondant on top and put a little applique. This is a royal icing transfer in the middle, gray royal icing transfer that I first sprayed with a silver spray to finish off the wheels. And then we've got these fun little spatulas. I start by creating the handle with a thin piece of gray fondant and then wrapping the handle end with red fondant, and then cutting a spatula type shape with a paring knife for the end of the spatula. And all I'm going to show you on this particular piece is how I put the two together, because that's a little bit tricky to form this piece. So to put the spatula together, you want to wait until your fondant pieces are completely dry and easily handled. And I'm just taking a touch of royal icing of glue consistency, putting it on the end, and then make sure that the end of the spatula engages with the glue, and then just prop up the end of the spatula with anything. I'm using a coupler for a pastry bag, but you could prop with anything. Let it dry completely, and then you'll ultimately be able to pick it up as one unit, like so. And let's continue around the accessory Lazy Susan and show you some other stuff. I'm also using little bits of aluminum foil, if you will. This is actually edible wafer paper with edible silver leaf stuck on top with a touch of corn syrup. I've got a little hamburger and cheese stuck in some of that. Now onto these plates, which I particularly love. They are actually a royal icing transfer. I'm going to show you completely how to make them and deck them out to create this little platter. So to make this shape, I'm using a silicone mold that has a flat bottom, and I'll have the source in the video description. I didn't want it to look like a bowl. I wanted it to be flat on the bottom, so I particularly chose this mold for that reason. And I am going to simply just pipe loose royal icing into the mold, make sure the mold's completely clean, nothing in it, because that'll end up in the transfer. And you want a relatively loose icing that settles into a nice flat shape with a little tap on the table. And I'm only filling it up, as you can see, part way to create a little edge on the plate, shaking it a little bit and setting it aside. Now this is a relatively deep transfer. It might not seem so here, but it's going to require a fair bit of drying time. I usually make these about a week ahead so that I can pop them out under certain conditions. They'll take that long to dry. But once they're dry, here's an example of a dry one, it just pops out really easily. So you have that nice rounded back side and a nice front side. Now for the detailing on it, to get all this red detailing, sort of the effect of a paper plate, I used an edible marker, and I'm going to put this on some non-skid material so this doesn't move around as I'm working on it. So I'm just going to trace around the back side with the fine tipped end to create the outer rim on the plate. Okay, I've got the outer ring, and then I'm going to do a little inner ring here for a little added detail. Okay, I changed my pen here, the orientation of it, so it's a little fatter here. But we'll cover that with some food. And then for the edging, I just drew straight lines relatively quick strokes I find is easier to get a straighter line if I do a quick stroke. I would let that dry a little bit. You can see it's glistening in certain areas before loading food on it. But just to put the food on it, let me just show you how I do that. That's nothing more than a little gluing process. I am going to put this together because we'll probably use it on the grill that we're going to assemble. Here I've got hot dogs already put together. I sandwiched them with a little white royal icing. Remember I talked about those buns with one of the hot dogs. And that looks just super cute. And wherever there is an imperfection, I will cover it with food. And I do like to make these accessories in advance. The good news is you can make them really far in advance and just store them in an airtight container until you're ready to put your grill together. That's a sample plate there. And then I just have a couple more accessories to talk about and one more to do, and that is the grill itself. Before we get to the grill though, I've got fire. Please refer to my cauldron video because I show exactly how I made that using a thick royal icing and a star tip and then spraying it with bronze luster spray. I've also got smoke, which is a two-dimensional royal icing transfer. I used a wet on wet technique, though with a relatively thick icing to create spirals with some texture. And the grill, the centerpiece, is what we want to talk about next. How do we get that? That's a royal icing transfer. It's extremely delicate and easily broken, so just be super careful with those. Like I don't want to drop it here, I might break it. And to make the grill, I'm using an icing of outlining consistency. It holds a relatively tight line. I've marked out the shape of the grill here, and I'm going to pipe really slowly so I can get around it in a nice round. If it's not perfectly round, it's not the end of the world. It'll be less noticeable when it's in the grill. Okay, and then the next thing I want to do is create two lines down the center roughly, as most grills have some center lines. I've colored this gray. We're going to spray it later so it'll be shiny and more silver-like. And then the next step is to create the lines going the opposite way. And I like to start in the middle and do one side piping left to right because I'm right-handed. And then I'll flip this around and pipe in the other direction. And the reason I do that is because I always use the line that I just piped to gauge how far apart to pipe the next line. And if I were to pipe this way, my hand would be covering the line. So I'm going to pipe left to right. Okay, and then at this stage, I'd come in while the icing's still somewhat wet and knock down these pieces. If you do that when it's too dry, you can break the entire piece. It will set pretty quickly. It just neatens it up a little bit. And now I would flip it around and pipe the other half the other direction using the previously piped line in the center as my gauge to measure the distance apart. Okay, I think that's pretty good, except for the break that I didn't fix there. And then knock down these edges a teeny bit. They will be concealed in the final construction and will be less noticeable. So there you have it. That again needs to dry until you can lift it off. The acetate, and just to show you what I mean by that, I've got a piece that I did earlier. I dried it. This has been sprayed with a silver spray, the Pme Edible Spray. But I use silver instead of pearl. And to get it off, you want to spray it before you actually lift the transfer off the acetate while it's still secured to the acetate, because if you spray it when it's not secured, you can blow the grill around and break it. And to get it off, I'm simply going to take a thin paring knife and gently lift. So once you've got it disengaged, you want to just slide it carefully off the acetate and onto a cardboard. I wouldn't put it back on the acetate because my acetate came off a roll and it has a little bit of a curve to it. And if you put it on curved acetate, you will snap it. So put it back on a cardboard until you're ready to assemble the grill. Till next video, live sweetly.